easy availability of music is something that all of us take for granted. Before the age of recording, a person could hear a particular piece of orchestral music, say in a concert hall, maybe once or twice a decade. Whereas now, music is available anywhere, anytime.
But has recording spoilt us and numbed us to the excitement and drama of the real thing?
The Big Bang that allowed music to be recorded was to change it forever. This programme is about the Big Bang caused by the invention of recorded sound, the enormous effect it's had on music, and the way it's changed the perceptions and expectations of us listeners. Recording unleashed onto the 20th century a massive amount of music in a multitude of forms. It gave music wings to cross the planet. The impact of recorded music wasn't confined to the listening public alone. 20th century composers were also profoundly changed by it. They took the new sounds and styles that recording made available and used them in their own compositions. The invention of recording altered the course of musical history. When people first started dreaming of recording sound, music wasn't at the top of the agenda. In a book in 1649, the real-life writer Cyrano de Bergerac had a vision of a journey to the moon, whose inhabitants had amazing talking books. To Captain Bergerac and his moon dwellers, recording speech, not music, was the impossible goal. The dream became a reality in 1877 with the recording of a children's nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. The machine that did it would turn its inventor into a household name, Thomas Alva Edison.
Word for word, I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
A heritage museum in West Orange, New Jersey, honours the man responsible for this landmark achievement. The phonograph, as Edison called his new contraption, takes pride of place.
A small thing that caused a big bang. The idea was this. You wrapped your tin foil around this cylinder, which you were able to turn with this handle here. Then you fix a needle into the middle of a diaphragm, which is inside here. And then you shout into this tube here as loudly as you can, and the vibrations caused by the sound bouncing against the diaphragm cause the needle to emboss the tin foil on the cylinder. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, her lamb was sure to go. Right, now we're going to see if that worked. Excellent.
Edison himself said, "I was never so taken aback in my life when he discovered his crude machine actually worked." The phonograph, despite its somewhat primitive technology, immediately caught the imagination of an American public hungry for new inventions and novelties. Within 50 years, the idea of a world without recorded music would become unthinkable. For the time being, though, music would have to wait, as the tinfoil could only be used a couple of times and it became useless once it was taken off the machine. One-off, lo-fi recordings made with a drawing pin and a strip of Bako foil frankly weren't going to cut the mustard. A dramatic improvement came in the 1880s with the innovation of wax cylinders, which could be used again and again, and therefore sold to the public. You can even play them today. Soon after, someone had the bright idea of using phonographs in nickel-in-the-slot machines, and the jukebox was born. It quickly became a national craze.
The Cincinnati Commercial Gazette of 1890 summed up the public mood. When a man can hear the 7th Regiment Band of New York play the Boulanger March, a cornet solo by Levi, or the famous song The Old Oaken Bucket for 5 cents, he has little desire to pay 5 cents to ascertain his weight or test the strength of his grip.
Edison may have invented the machine. To his astonishment, it was public taste that determined its true destiny, the playing of music.
What made the jukeboxes so instantly likeable was the choice of music available. Comic and sentimental songs, novelty acts from vaudeville, military bands, hymns, and light dancing tunes. No wonder the posh classical music world, patronising then as now, turned their noses up at the new medium.
Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame was typical of many.
I am astonished and somewhat terrified. Astonished at the wonderful power you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous, bad music may be put on record forever.
For the next 100 years, classical musicians were to echo Sullivan's complaint about the huge popularity of music they considered to be inferior. But there were isolated examples of classical music finding its way onto early wax cylinders. A live recording of Handel's epic oratorio Israel in Egypt was made at the Crystal Palace in London in 1888 and is thought to be the earliest surviving music recording in existence.
To make it, 2 blokes sat all evening in the balcony with a tiny phonograph machine poked over the edge. It's amazing they got anything, really.
Given the appalling quality of the sound reproduction, it's hardly surprising that classical musicians were slow to come forward to make recordings. Since the records only lasted 2 minutes, the music too had to be crudely hacked about to fit.
Yet another serious drawback was that the only way to produce discs for sale was to record the piece again and again into a number of cylinders at once, known as gang recordings. Even then, it might take a whole day to record 200 copies of the same 2-minute song. What was needed was a way to mass-produce recordings. The ingenious Emil Berliner solved the problem with the invention of the flat disc gramophone. Because it recorded onto a master disc, an unlimited number of copies could be made, rather like the process of running off prints from a photographic negative.
This is one of the first ever Berliner single-sided discs, which was meant to run at 120 revolutions per minute or thereabouts. On the back it actually had the words for you in case you couldn't hear what they were singing. And at 5 inches across, it's remarkably similar to a modern CD.
Later, Berliner's rubber discs were replaced by shellac, a material made, believe it or not, from crushed Malaysian beetles. In London, Emil Berliner's representatives had formed what was to become today's EMI, the Gramophone Company,
which became world famous not just because of its recording output, but also because of a dog. Nipper here, in a portrait called His Master's Voice, became one of the most recognisable brands in the world.
Whilst under no illusion that popular music was to be the real honeypot, the gramophone company nevertheless longed for respectability. This was something, they believed, that only classical music could bring. So they went about exploiting a fashion amongst the bourgeoisie for grand opera. Verdi had only died in 1901, and his successors, most of all Puccini, were alive and active. The turn of the century was for many a golden age of opera. The gramophone company began a determined effort to ensnare the top operatic stars into the recording business. They even gave them their own red label to make them seem like champagne amidst all the rest of the commercial plonk on offer. They weren't just interested, though, in the already famous stars of the time. Indeed, their most astonishing breakthrough came with a young, up-and-coming tenor from Naples, Enrico Caruso, who became the most famous singer in the world. The man who was to become the toast of the Western world began life in what was then, as now, one of the poorest cities in Europe. With Caruso's rise to stardom, the gramophone was transformed from an interesting but train-spotterish novelty into a populist worldwide phenomenon. Enrico Caruso was one of 7 children born to a working-class family in this house in the Via San Giovannello. As a teenager, Caruso made a few lira every night, singing Neapolitan songs for the cafe customers on the waterfront. He died in the luxury hotel opposite 30 years later, unimaginably wealthy from the royalties of his million-selling discs. It was while he was working the waterfront trattorias that the young Caruso was discovered. Before long, he turned professional. At the age of 27, he was invited to sing at the holiest of all opera's shrines, La Scala Milan. It was here that Caruso attracted the interest of one of the most important pioneers of the industry, the gramophone company's chief recording engineer and talent spotter, Fred Geisberg. This was to be the recording world's equivalent of Stanley meeting Livingston. They decided to make their first recording just up the road from the Opera House in Caruso's suite at the Grand Hotel.
A deal was struck to make 10 records for £100, much to the horror of Geisberg's London office, which sent a blunt telegram saying, "Fee exorbitant, forbid you to record."
But on April the 11th, 1902, Geisberg backed his hunch and went ahead anyway. In this very room in the Grand Hotel, in just 2 hours, those 10 records were cut that made gramophone history. Fittingly, the first record made was an aria from Caruso's current La Scala success, Franchetti's Germania. After the release of the 10 records, Caruso's reputation quickly spread across Europe and America. For the first time ever, an artist was booked to appear at the Metropolitan Opera in New York simply on the strength of a recording. Until his death in 1921, Caruso made over 200 records, achieving a worldwide fame that no singer had ever had before. Caruso was the first recording megastar. It's often said that the gramophone made Caruso. Perhaps it's fairer to say that Caruso made the gramophone. Caruso's Vesti la Giubba from Leoncavallo's opera I Pagliacci was the world's first million-selling disc. Here's the man himself appearing in a silent movie. This is what it would have sounded like if films in 1918 had had sound as well. Caruso's voice had a timbre and range that perfectly suited the limitations of the medium. It could soar and tremble with such strength that the background hiss and the distant accompaniment were all but forgotten. To many people, hearing Caruso scale the summits of high opera was both miraculous and moving. It wasn't just their first experience of the true potential of the gramophone, it was also a gateway to the whole classical repertoire. Edison's Big Bang became a universal gift with the popularity of Caruso, and classical music was catapulted out of the small, secret world it had hitherto known. Thanks to his success, all the other top singers of the day now dropped their objections to recording once they realised that it could take their voices into the world's living rooms and make them rich too. The prize catch was Dame Nellie Melba, an Australian soprano superstar who held out until she got £1,000, her own unique mauve label, and a pudding named after her. Her records, by the way, cost a whopping 21 shillings each. Their high sound quality might surprise anyone who thinks of the old 78s as just hiss and crackle. Perhaps most curious of all are the only recordings from 1902 of a very different kind of soprano, Alessandro Moreschi, the last living castrato. Castrati, you may remember, were male sopranos whose testicles were removed before puberty to stop their voice ranges dropping to baritone or bass. This once popular technique died out in the 19th century, not entirely surprisingly. The recordings of Moreschi, by then in his 60s, represent some of the most haunting and, let's be honest, frightening sung performances known to man. Notwithstanding records like these, the listening public grew relentlessly. The arrival of portable record players meant that music could not only be heard in the home, but just about anywhere. Music intended for the concert hall could now be heard in, say, a cocktail bar. Music written for the theatre could be enjoyed in a station waiting room. And music intended for use in a grand cathedral could now be heard as the accompaniment for a merry picnic. Like it or not, the gramophone caused music to lose its original context. Advances in technology were about to transfer the grandeur and richness of the symphony orchestra onto disc. How on earth were the highbrows of the classical world going to handle the cheapening, as they would see it, of their glorious repertoire by the spread of the gramophone? Even in its early years, the gramophone could reproduce the singing voice passably well, but capturing the instrumental repertoire was fraught with difficulty, thanks to the crudeness of the recording machinery.
What we're going to do now is lay on a demonstration to show how unbelievably tricky the recording process was in the first 20 years of the 20th century. This string trio and I are going to play some Mendelssohn, and meanwhile sound experts Sean Davis and Duncan Miller, with their 1911 acoustic recording lathe, are going to cut a master disc of what we play using original technology. 1 and 2.
This is what the piece sounds like using modern microphones. And here's our ancient gramophone version. You'll immediately notice that the piano is very faint, as is the cello, while the double bass has disappeared almost entirely. The reason for this is that these sounds are too low, too quiet, and too subtle to be picked up by crude metal funnels and a Heath Robinson-like lathe. So how on earth did they get round the problem in the early 1900s? The pioneer recording engineers improvised vigorously, making the musicians bunch up as close as possible round the recording horn. Or at least the musicians got to know each other very well. They took the backs off pianos and stuck them on raised platforms, and they concocted something called a Stroh violin that could play more loudly than a normal one, even if it did look a little eccentric.
The other, much more drastic solution they adopted was to replace the weedy strings with beefy wind and brass instruments. Now this time, in theory, the antique recording device should be able to pick up all parts of the music.
And it does. This is what these instruments would have sounded like in 1911. These techniques, though ingenious, weren't always what the composer intended, however. Here's a 1908 recording of Mozart's overture to the Marriage of Figaro, in which all the strings have been replaced by a brass band. Fortunately for string players, a major leap forward was in the offing.
A huge breakthrough in recording quality came with the introduction into studios of the electric microphone in 1925. This was much more sensitive and could cope with a wider range of frequencies, so musicians didn't have to cluster anymore around various funnels and horns to be heard.
Its impact was felt most of all in popular music.
It had to be you. It had to be you. I wandered around and finally found the somebody who couldn't make me be true.
No longer needing to bellow into a tin funnel like a sports coach into a megaphone, singers could murmur intimately into the mic. Crooning in a gentle and sentimental way made the singer seem more personal. From that moment on, popular singers developed their technique deliberately to exploit the microphone.
It had to be you, wonderful you. It had to be you. I hear music when I look at you.
Perhaps the most famous popular singer of the century, Frank Sinatra, was able to weave and linger around his accompaniment, to stretch the rhythm mischievously and to tease the song's melody precisely because of the rich supportive power of the electric microphone. This was the aural equivalent of cinema's close-up. The electric mic's impact on the classical world was more subtle, but no less dramatic. Now the quieter instruments could be artificially boosted over the rest of the orchestra. At last, the full range of the symphonic repertoire could begin to find its way into the homes of millions of people. The advent of recorded sound vastly increased the audience for serious concert music. The great classical works, from Mozart's operas to Brahms's symphonies, had only ever been heard, and sporadically at that, by a tiny, educated, relatively well-off audience. But this vast new egalitarian constituency for music naturally had different priorities. The power of the consumer was to have a decisive effect on music. Now, for the first time, ordinary music lovers could play exactly what they chose. And what they chose, by and large, was the familiar and melodious. In the 1930s, new music like Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto would have struck many gramophone owners as rather plinkety-plonkety and discordant, not quite their cup of tea. Whether you liked the record or not, there was still the problem that the old 78s ran for a maximum of 6 minutes. But in 1948 that was solved, to the relief of the Malaysian Beatles, when Columbia introduced their new wonder material, vinyl. Not only was vinyl more resilient than shellac, but it could also support a micro groove, allowing the record to play at the new slower speed of 33 1/3 RPM and contain much more material than the old shellac 78s. The long player had arrived, and record listeners could look forward to something like 25 minutes of uninterrupted music. In the 1950s, the recording industry went into overdrive. A vast range of music found its way onto disc. A new generation of stars came to the fore. This was the heyday, for example, of Maria Callas, the female successor to Caruso. Like Caruso, Callas became a superstar because of the success of her recordings. Indeed, many of her operatic roles were sung just for the studio and not on stage at all. The control achieved in the studio meant that her vocal performances could be heard with absolute clarity, and the unusual passion of her interpretations was given an almost embarrassing intimacy. In the 1960s, stereophonic sound hit the market and the repertoire expanded all over again. To fuel the ever-growing demand for new product, unlike the rock industry which favoured new artists and composers, the classical sector began to trawl repertoire from further and further back in time. Believe it or not, in the 1930s, Vivaldi's Four Seasons and Bach's Brandenburg concertos were virtually unknown pieces. Nowadays, they are the granary bread and butter of classical fare. The development of stereophonic sound in the 1950s and its marketing in the 1960s meant that everyone had to replace their old mono LPs with new stereo ones, especially when it came to albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which made a special feature of the new technique. In the classical world, the stereo experience gave a greater sense of perspective and width to the sound. For example, by laying a symphony orchestra across the two speakers from left to right. But it also made the recorded sound more and more its own thing and less like the live concert auditorium. This process was even more prevalent behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the listening public. Since the 1940s, when music began to be recorded onto magnetic tape rather than disc masters, different performances of the same piece could now be sliced up and stuck together. When you listen, say, to a Mozart symphony, you're actually hearing hundreds of edited segments spliced together. Nowadays, the process of cut and paste is done by computers, but the principle is exactly the same. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 edits.
About that, yes.
Seconds.
In fact, at the moment, as things stand, there's about 2,000 edits in the whole thing.
In one piece of music?
In one piece of music, yes. So if we go
the opera receiving 2,000 edits, by the way, is Verdi's Ennani, and it's only just over 2 hours long. Over the years, what has emerged is the idea of a definitive performance of a particular piece frozen in time. A false perfection, you might say. We've therefore witnessed a battle between the concept of music on the one hand as a living, breathing, organic condition, ceaselessly reinventing itself, never static, never finished, and on the other hand, the concept of music as a thing, like a building, a poem, a painting, or a sculpture. Throughout the 20th century, composers and performers grappled with these two conflicting views of music. In the modern age, music played for a live audience and music played to be recorded have become two different things. Concert musicians are in effect competing with the way they sound on disc.
Many recordings have the soloist pushed very far forward, and particularly with an instrument like the cello. It's not the most powerful instrument, and yet you hear many cello concerto recordings with a cello absolutely, you're inside the instrument. And of course, that doesn't happen in the concert hall. But sometimes people get very disappointed when they come into a concert hall and they don't hear the balance they've heard on a disc. People are so used to hearing technically perfect recording that our musicians get very wary of taking risks in the concert hall. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, recording has vastly increased the technical proficiency of musicians because you can't get away now of turning up in the concert hall and sounding much, much worse than the recordings people have been listening to at home. So, of course, it has led to a lack of risk-taking and a uniformity of performance.
Not only did recording standardise performance styles, it also standardised the repertoire. Prior to the arrival of recorded sound, the overwhelming majority of concerts would have included music of that period's living composers. In sharp contrast, the story of listening preferences in the 20th century is more or less the triumph of the past over the present. As the public became more and more seduced by the music of previous centuries, contemporary living composers were left increasingly cut adrift. They began searching for new ways to attract the listening public.
One of these came from an unexpected source. As soon as portable recording machines were available, intrepid engineers like the gramophone company's Fred Geisberg set off across the globe to capture on them the strange and wonderful sounds of music from other cultures. Of course, this widened the musical horizons of record listeners, but it also broadened the minds and triggered the imaginations of composers too. Before the invention of recorded sound, if you wanted to hear a Magyar folk ensemble or a raga band, you'd have had to travel to Hungary or India to do so. After Edison's phonograph, you could listen to the world's music in your own living room. In addition, composers and musicologists could analyse in great detail music that had never been notated. During the early 1900s, the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók took a phonograph and recorded the folk music of his native country. After analysing this ethnic raw material, he then wrote his own pieces inspired by it. Classical composers like Bartók learnt many things from the study of ethnic music through recording, not least of which were ways of treating the musical language itself that were not bound by the old rules of rhythm, harmony and melody that they'd been brought up on. All composers started to hear music differently. Over the course of the century, one form of music above all others came to exert its influence on European music, thanks to Edison's ingenious invention. This music was, of course, African. The English composer David Fanshawe toured Africa, the Middle East and the Pacific in the 60s, 70s and 80s, compiling a vast library of tapes of tribal music. Fanshawe's African Sanctus mixes Western and African music using his tapes with live instruments and singers.
The backing track was recorded 30 years ago in Uganda, so it's a traditional tribal dance. Yeah. It's a bwala dance, which is a welcome, of the Acholi tribe. And I am trying to synchronise what I'm hearing in my head, which is full choir, with the tape.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I started out as a traveller with a notebook and a camera, and then I used to hear sounds in the markets and the bazaars and the churches and wherever I was. I would hear strange sounds that, I had not heard before. Yeah. Then that led me to think, I better record them for posterity. And then that led me to think, but I'm a composer, I'm so inspired, I want to join in, I want to experiment with this. I suppose I'm a kind of early sampler, if you like. I was sampling the world. It seems to me that all music is related. All human beings, regardless of colour, race, creed, nationality, we are all interrelated musically. We have a soul, and that soul is the universal music, the universality of music. That's how it appears to me. And this is why I feel I can make a comment as a composer, join in, comment on, and retain the essence of, hopefully, the beauty of pure music, pure sound.
The whole planet came to experience African roots through the popular music of Black America. The rhythm, soul, and energy of African music, as carried across to the Americas by 2 million slaves,
gave birth to wave after wave of new musical forms and styles, from jazz to hip-hop, from ragtime to jungle, from the blues to Motown. Recording took the music of Black America out of tiny bars and clubs, out of remote neighborhood churches, out of deprived ghettos and into the homes and lives of the rest of the planet. From Stravinsky and Ravel onwards, many composers from the European classical tradition have succumbed to the power of Afro-American music. But it hasn't all been a one-way street. Black popular musicians were in turn influenced by the classics. In the last 40 or so years, though, one astonishing development above all others has borne witness to the cross-fertilization that Edison's Big Bang brought to life. Avant-garde composers from a classical background were engaged in experiments in sound and technology that were to have an equally profound effect on popular music. In the 1950s, experimental composers like Karlheinz Stockhausen began to incorporate new, non-instrumental sounds into their compositions. They pioneered electronic music, synthesizers, and perhaps most crucially of all, the technique known as sampling. They probably don't know it, but every DJ in the world is now mixing dance music with the help of these techniques.
Mary had a little lamb.
Digital sampling is the love child of recording and music. Few composers have been as intrigued by its possibilities and as key to its development as the brilliant New Yorker Steve Reich.
The most likely candidate for working with tape, to my ear, was the human voice. And when you do that with a voice, you begin to hear the pitch. And the music of the speech becomes equal to the meaning. It's as if by the repetition, you jack up the musical parameter.
For me, the most moving work to attempt the blend of speech, tape, and live performance is Reich's 1988 masterwork, Different Trains, a haunting and powerful evocation of his childhood and a reflection on the American Jewish experience.
I don't know how, it popped into my mind, but I began thinking about my own past, my childhood, and about these train trips that I took as a child. Since my parents had divorced when I was 1 year old, my mother had gone to Los Angeles. She was a singer. My father remained in New York City. He was a lawyer. And from the age of 1 to the age of about 5, when I had to start going to school, I used to go back and spend 6 months in New York, 6 months in Los Angeles.
Crack train from New York.
The sampled voices are those of Reich's governess, who accompanied him on his long journeys, and an elderly Pullman porter.
On the extra border, when we run to Chicago, we leave here on Liberty Limited out of Washington, D.C., see? So that was the crack train out of D.C. The crack train from New York, crack train from New York, New York.
And I thought, well, now, let's see, when was that? And when that was 1937, 38, 39, 40, 41. And I thought, well, those years, if I had been on the other side of the Atlantic and had been in Brussels or Frankfurt or Dusseldorf, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So then the idea of these simultaneous train rides sort of went off in my head.
In the second movement, we hear the voices of Holocaust survivors describing their very different experiences on the appalling train journeys they were forced to make in Europe during the Second World War.
They shaved us. They shaved us. They tattooed a number on our arm.
The only sounds besides the voices are whistles, train whistles, and in the second movement, the movement about Europe and the Holocaust, there are some engines trying to make it up a grade and sort of groaning. Well, their whistles sound like a groan, and that was particularly appropriate for sort of pulling into Auschwitz.
The war was over.
The third and final movement of Different Trains after the war is an attempt to reconcile the painful memories of the past with the present.
Are you sure?
Few contemporary composers have managed as effectively to marry such ideas with musical techniques that themselves defy the old musical boundaries.
The war is over.
Composers that I consider interesting are aware of this technology, are aware of these possibilities, and are using them. And I think that they're in touch with the folk music of our time, because the folk music of our time is electronic. This is what people do uncoached and unbidden in their garages, in their homes, and then eventually it becomes professional. And that is the mark of folk music. It's just urban, because we don't have much left but urban.
The tradition of European classical music that we've been following in this series is being absorbed into a much bigger mainstream, one that is overwhelmingly dominated by popular music of all forms. Music historians of the future might describe this moment in time as the age of convergence. Whatever other prophets of doom may say, Western classical music really isn't dead yet. But it is like a cleverly mutating DNA gene, transforming itself and cross-fertilizing with other forms right in front of our eyes. What we're witnessing is the meltdown of previously rigid musical compartments and styles, a process we owe principally to Edison's Big Bang, the invention of recorded sound. What seems wonderful to me is that the big bangs we've looked at in this series, the inventions of musical notation, opera, modern tuning, the piano and recording, all started small, local and specific, whereas today they're the bread and butter of musicians from many different styles, cultures and traditions. Music is simply unthinkable without them. I don't, of course, know what the next great breakthrough will be, the impact of the internet perhaps, but what I am sure of is that we're bequeathing to the generations that follow us a treasure of incomparable value and beauty.